All right, so it's 1 p.m. People are going to be coming in. While people are coming in, why don't we go around and introduce ourselves and say something we know about the prophets. Now, let me say right now, you don't actually have to participate. You can just be an audience member, an observer. So I'm not going to call on everyone. I'm not going to, go down the line and say, okay, now you speak. But you can. There's going to be a lot of opportunities for you to participate if you want to. We're going to be reading texts together. I'm not going to do all the reading. I'm not going to do all the talking. I'd like to hear from you, and I'd like for us to engage the prophets together. So to start that, well, let's say who we are and something we know about the prophets. I'm not going to say something I know about the prophets because that's the whole point of this. This Zoom meeting or whatever, this workshop. So I'm Jack, and I love the prophets. Whoever wants to go next can go next.
My name's Andy. I'm going to be mostly on mute and off video because I am not quite ready for the rest of the world yet. But I was super excited to do this. I think of the prophets mostly as angry and unhappy, and I don't know much about them. So I was really excited for this call.
Thank you, Andy.
My name's Chris, and I'm calling in from Norfolk, Virginia, and I'm really happy to be here and a part of it today. And I think one of the most significant things that I think I understand about the prophets is that they speak truth to power.
Great. Thank you, Chris. Chris is a friend of mine, went back from when I was in undergrad, so 2 years ago. I'm kidding. No, when Debbie and I met in Virginia Beach, we went to a church there, and that's where I met Chris, and we've been friends for a while. All right. Anyone else want to share what their name is and what they know about the prophets, or just something they know about the prophets?
I will. So my name is Helen. I know nothing about the prophets. And I'm not being modest. I really know nothing. I'm here. I came to the dinner, I think on Monday night, and I had such a lovely time. Really wonderful. So that's what I'm doing here. And as I mentioned on Monday, that I have to leave at 2. So I can only stay till 2 o'clock.
Well, the recording will be available, so if you
thank you.
Later, I'm gonna post it on YouTube and whatever. So, but thanks for sharing.
You're
you
welcome.
Certainly don't have to know anything about the prophets.
I can go next.
Yeah. Okay.
My name is Debbie, and I know a few things about the prophets. But I think one of the things that I learned that I thought was most interesting about the prophets is that often their people and their, hometown and their regime, they were not popular. It's the old saying, the prophet is never welcome in his hometown. So that's something that I know about many of the prophets.
Yeah. Thank you, Debbie. Would anyone else like to share before we get started?
I'll go. Let's see, I'm Waven. I'm gonna have to disappear and eat my lunch at some point, and I'll probably have to leave early too. I mean, I'll just take myself off screen, but whatever. Prophets are sort of the naysayers. When things are good, they're all doom and gloom. When things are bad, they're the voice of hope and restoration. So they buck the trend.
Thanks for that. Yeah, and if you want to eat, it's a Saturday afternoon. If you want to drink your Saturday afternoon drink of choice, if you want to come in and out, that I'm pretty. I'm kind of an anarchist in my understanding of the classroom. Anything goes. So if you can engage as much as you want to engage and step out as much as you want to step out, eat food, whatever. Yeah, Naomi.
Hi, I'm Naomi. So I studied a fair amount of the prophets in undergrad. And one thing that was really interesting to me is it gave me a lot of context for reading the Hebrew Bible through a historical lens.
Hmm.
And I never really saw the prophets as bearers of good news. Um, a lot of the prophets that I read were like pretty down on Israel and the Jewish people at the time. So excited to be here.
Yeah. Yeah, it is funny. It's like when one is steeped in the prophetic tradition and when one is trying to voice again what they voiced in their time, you'll often get the charge, you're too negative. Like you should be more positive. Jesus was more positive. He wasn't that negative. Yeah, so we're going to take a look at that. That'll be one of the things that we take a look at is what is this supposed negativity that's in the prophets, and is there a positive side to the prophets? So thank you, Naomi.
Jack, can I suggest you take down the share screen so we can see people as opposed to, a picture?
Well, we're gonna yeah, I can do that for now, but we're going to be going through a PowerPoint together, and everyone's going to have to be able to read.
Okay, that's fine. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to.
By the way, feel free to, ask questions, to interject. Like I said, anything goes. So feel free to chime in. Anyone else want to introduce themselves and what they know about the prophets before we get started? Robert, yeah.
So for those of you who haven't met me, as you can see on the screen probably, my name's Robert. I've always been particularly struck by the prophets as representing an important part of the moral core of Scripture. But one book that I've been reading, had been reading several months ago, got about halfway through, and now I'm trying to carve out time to get back into is Abraham Heschel's book on the prophets, which is fantastic. And I'm really struck by his characterization of a prophet as someone who is sort of participating in the pathos of God and the sort of moral and emotional life of God.
Yeah.
Which is a really fascinating way of framing it that I think is very different from sort of the colloquial understanding that people often have of a prophet as someone who kind of gets and transmits a message in sort of purely literal terms, as though they're given a set of quotations to recite or a vision to repeat, and that's it, as though they're just sort of a computer screen or a radio or something like that. I think it's an interesting, very different and richer way of framing what their role and character is.
I think Heschel was very involved in the civil rights movement.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Right?
Yep.
He marched with Martin Luther King.
That's what I thought.
He awarded Martin Luther King with the Judaism and World Peace Award in, I think, 1965. It's in the PowerPoint.
Interesting.
We're going to be talking about Abraham Heschel today because I'm a big fan.
Yeah. Well, he was, I mean, I don't really know anything about him, but I think he was great. He was terrific, right?
Yeah, I mean,
and
we won't learn so much about him and his life today, but we'll take a look at his prophets book.
I see.
So,
also, I think I'm a little mixed up. I thought this was supposed to be a civil rights discussion. I think I got it wrong.
Well, it's an introduction to the biblical prophets, and then in the second part, we'll move into an analysis of prophets in the African American tradition.
Oh, I see.
So yeah. So and how they kind of pick up the prophetic tradition and become the prophets of the United States. And
Right.
so we're going to look at texts from the Bible and texts from the African American prophetic.
I see. Okay.
That was a good clarification. I mean, it'll all be made clear.
You know, it's interesting because I've been singing the song "Let My Little Light Shine" since I was very little, and I never knew that it came from the Bible.
Wow. Yeah. No, lots of awesome stuff comes from the Bible.
I know. I thought it was just like a regular folk song.
So, all right. Well, let's go ahead and get started. I'll share the PowerPoint again. Okay. So, wait. Do I want to have? I have some introductory remarks. Actually, I need to share with y'all before I go into the PowerPoint. The prophets are the rebels of the Bible. They operate on the margins of their social world, always swimming against the stream. But they are not rebels without a cause, but the opposite, rebels with a divine cause. They speak truth to power. They expose hypocrisy, corruption, moral negligence, and systemic sin. They take a stand against the status quo and in favor of God's future. They are not interested in expediency or pragmatism, rather they demand the impossible. They fight for lost causes. They defy hopelessness, and they defy nihilism. Fully human, steeped in their own human tradition, they nevertheless speak as if they have come from another planet, to warn inhabitants of planet Earth of the consequences of continuing in their current direction. This is a tremendous burden. To hold on to the truth in the midst of falsehood, to know justice in the midst of injustice, to know glory in the midst of evil. As Heschel says, the prophets are able to hold God and humanity in the same thought. At the beginning of the book of Jeremiah, God introduces himself to the prophet, saying, "Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. Before you were born, I set you apart. I appointed you as a prophet to the nations." How idealistic and romantic of God. How special for Jeremiah. And yet Jeremiah's first word in response is, "Alas!" For he understood that being a prophet is no picnic. It is an unparalleled burden. Now, Sigmund Freud criticized religion as wish fulfillment. He said religious ideas are illusions, fulfillments of the oldest, strongest, and most urgent wishes of mankind. But apparently, Freud knew little about the prophets, for their task is to disillusion and to dispel fairy tale ideas that make people complacent. When the people wanted wish fulfillment, the prophets refused to give it to them. "Tell us what we want to hear," they begged. "Weep and wail for the miseries that are coming upon you," replies the prophet. The prophet confronts the people with the truth. Today, I want to encourage all of us and anyone who is struggling with their faith, anyone who is troubled by hypocrisy and corruption and injustice and negligence and fakeness, particularly in the church, read the prophets, because everything you feel today, your frustration and disappointment and disillusionment and passion for justice, all of it was felt by the prophets. They knew it as deeply as any person can know it, and they prophesied in spite of it all. They witnessed to the truth, nevertheless. They reconciled their rebellion and their faith by becoming agents of God's rebellion. Let them bring hope and inspiration to us today. So now we can start this blessed PowerPoint. All right, so just to go over, my point today is for us to engage texts. So I don't want to do too much introductory talking, and I don't want to do too much lecturing. I want to give us the chance to read together and reflect together. But let me give you a basic agenda of what we're going to be doing today. I'll introduce who I am and some basic info on the prophets, some misconceptions about the prophets. And then in part one, we're going to look at who are the prophets of the Bible, looking at the background, the tradition that they drew from, and generally providing a picture of what their mission is, their concern for justice. And then once we have that background, we'll go into some texts. We'll look at Abraham Heschel talking about the prophets, Walter Brueggemann talking about the prophets, and then the prophets in their own words, looking at texts from Jeremiah, Amos, and Isaiah. At any point, feel free to, chat me, wave, interject, ask questions, whatever. And then in the second part, we'll look at prophets in African American history, looking at the background of African oppression in the United States, and then Cornel West talking about prophetic utterance, and then African American prophets in their own words, specifically texts from Maria Stewart, Frederick Douglass, Martin Luther King, and Malcolm X. Now, this selection is intentional, but there are like pros and cons. These three names, Douglass, King, and Malcolm X, they're, household names. We're kind of more or less familiar with them as figures. So I included them because I wanted to let us read texts of people that we hear about a lot, but maybe don't actually read a lot. But then this special one, Maria Stewart, I have added for the particular reason of, one, again, witnessing to the prophetic tradition in the slavery period. Frederick Douglass ends up being like a very significant voice in the post-slavery world. Maria Stewart is one of the first women, period, who speak in public in the United States. And she speaks against slavery. She speaks in favor of female empowerment. And she draws a lot from the Bible and is very scriptural. That sounds like a weird word, but she's very biblical in her addresses, and there's a lot of that prophetic fire and that boldness in her, and I wanted to take a look at that. But obviously there are so many names that could be added to this list. The Ida B. Wells, Sojourner Truth, later Angela Davis. We've got Du Bois and Marcus Garvey. I mean, the African American tradition is full of prophets. There are so many wonderful voices, and I encourage you to go above and beyond this study and look at other names. We're only going to get a snapshot of the African American prophetic tradition and the biblical prophetic tradition. This is not supposed to be comprehensive. Okay, so a little bit of introduction, some background on myself. I grew up in American evangelical Christianity. I was surrounded by biblical inerrancy and charismatic prophecy. Prophecy, where I grew up, was a kind of spontaneous prayer where you tap into the Spirit and you're kind of given like a Spirit-filled stream of consciousness, and God just talks to you spontaneously out of kind of whatever is going on in your head. And so it ends up becoming divorced from any kind of biblical tradition of prophecy, where like what the prophets are saying doesn't really have much to do with the prophecy that I grew up with. In the prophets of the Bible, when I grew up, those were just the people who predicted Jesus. Like, Jesus is coming, and the prophets said that. So we didn't really read a lot of the prophets growing up, because that wasn't very interesting, just because, well, we've got Jesus. We don't need to read the people who predicted the coming of Jesus, because we've got Jesus. So, I mean, that might be a little uncharitable, but in actual fact, we did not read a lot of the prophets. And once I started reading the prophets, it really blew my mind. And I did that when I went to Regent University, which is a notoriously conservative Christian school. It's Pat Robertson's school. He's still the president of it. And it was at this university, ironically, that I started taking Bible studies classes, and I took a class on the prophets. And this is where I really fell in love with them. I read Abraham Heschel's book on the prophets, and I read some other books on the prophets, and I dug into them and just fell in love with what they were saying. And that is actually what instilled in me like a social awakening, where I started to see the Bible's relevance for social issues today. And, you know, I mean, what's funny about that is the Christians that I grew up with, they'll often say that people are liberal because they're taught liberalism, you know, like they go to schools that teach liberalism. Whereas I went to a conservative Christian university, and it was there that I became a lefty, you know, like where I started really being concerned about social issues. And so once I got there and I wanted to continue my theological education, I wanted to go somewhere that was going to be more sensitive to social issues than Regent was. So I went to Union Theological Seminary here in New York and studied with Cornel West and James Cone and some other wonderful professors, and learned more about the prophetic tradition there, but also not just the biblical prophetic tradition, but the African-American prophetic tradition. And today I am sort of a weird hybrid between Lutheran and Reformed. I go to a Lutheran church and a Reformed church, and a lot of my Lutheran church congregants are here today. Thank you for coming. So yeah, so that's some background on myself. Some quick things to note about the prophets is they actually have very little to do with predicting the coming of Jesus. If you want to say that they are predicting the coming of Jesus, that would still be a small fraction of what they're saying. Predicting the coming Messiah is not their main focus. They're more about telling the truth concerning their specific time, responding to events in their time with the truth of God. And they draw on the Mosaic tradition that they have, the covenant obligations that they have been given, that have been passed down to them. But their point is more about forthtelling than it is really about foretelling. And that difference is foretelling is predicting the future, right? This is what's going to happen, you know, this is who's going to be president, you know, this is who's, you know, we're seeing a lot of that right now. We're seeing a lot of predictions, like the one who predicted Donald Trump's presidency is now making a new prediction. You know, we see these headlines. Whereas forthtelling is more about social analysis and social commentary, and bringing somewhat of an indictment, somewhat of a vision, but bringing in a criticism and vision specifically to people struggling with particular issues in their own time. So because of that, you can't understand the prophets without understanding their context. Now, I will say we're not going to get into a ton of like historical context stuff because I want to focus mainly on the texts. But you'll see in these texts that the concern is social issues that the Israelites are dealing with in their time. All right, let's get this going. Who are the biblical prophets? The Hebrew word for prophet is navi, or plural nevi'im. It's a royal messenger called to relay a message from the king, or in this case, to relay a message from God. And the epitome of prophecy of the prophet in the Bible is Moses. He's the archetype for the Messiah, he's the archetype for the king, and he's the archetype for the prophets. And you can kind of see how he speaks truth to power in Egypt on behalf of the oppressed Israelites. And then when they're in the wilderness, he speaks truth to the community, leading the way, showing what God is revealing to them as their duty and responsibility and their obligations as a community, rebuking them when they're being faithless. You know, there's a prophetic witness. He is keeping them, trying to keep them glued to the message of God. I will put my words in the prophet's mouth, and he will tell the people everything I command him. This is sort of this comes from Deuteronomy 18, which is a key text for understanding the role of the prophet in the Bible. So what is that message of God that they tie in, that they want the community to be bound to? And this has a lot to do with the book of Deuteronomy. I would really suggest, I think we all need to reread the book of Deuteronomy. It's so full of so many wonderful things, and it doesn't get read a lot because, again, there's in churches there's this there's this supersessionism about Jesus, like, oh, Deuteronomy, well, that's the law, Jesus fulfilled that, so who cares? And that's just not okay. The basis of the covenant obligations that Moses puts to the people in the wilderness is, I am the Lord your God who brought you up out of the land of Egypt. Look up how many times that phrase appears in Deuteronomy. It's again and again and again. They establish a law, and then it says, now remember, I am the Lord your God who brought you up out of the land of Egypt. And the point, as Walter Brueggemann here says, the God who has liberated issues commands that intend to create a community that will practice an emancipatory ethic. So the God who delivered them from slavery in Egypt is now basing their post-slavery community on an ethic of freedom. They have to be a community of liberation, a community of freedom. And so this manifests itself in laws and in codes of charity, codes of compassion. You see below the examples. They are to share their surplus. They're supposed to be charitable towards each other, distributing wealth around the community, not letting people exist in poverty and in utter need, opposing usury, opposing exploiting people for their poverty and putting them into debt and into debt slavery. It opposes slavery. It opposes, or it at least sets a boundary to slavery and says, not only after 7 years do you have to free your slaves, but you have to give to them liberally so that they can make their own, so that they can have their own sense of well-being and establish their own livelihood, which is such a, I mean, the United States has still to this day refused to enact the ethic of the book of Deuteronomy toward the slaves that have existed in the United States, because we've never offered reparations. And we continually resist that notion, and yet it's in the book of Deuteronomy that is what we're supposed to do when we free slaves. Practice of the Sabbath is also an emancipatory ethic, as opposed to working all the time, being your sole purpose in life being to work and to produce and to be a laborer and to be useful. There is one day out of the week where you have to not do any of that, because you are not to be defined by your work. You're not supposed to be a slave. You're not defined by what the work that you contribute to society or what you produce in society. You are to be defined by your identity as a child of God, as one of the chosen of God, and therefore you have to take one day to remind yourself about how God is a liberating God who doesn't want to enslave people. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt. Care for the poor, the vulnerable, and immigrants. These are all outlined in Deuteronomy as essential aspects of community life for the people of God. And it's precisely because they were liberated. So again, the God who has liberated issues commands that intend to create a community that will practice an emancipatory ethic. And this is the Mosaic tradition that the prophets draw from, that they take their lead from the God of the Exodus, the God of freedom. And their essential message becomes the people have failed to live up to these covenant obligations, the covenant obligations given to them by the God who liberated them from slavery. Ezekiel says, turn back and live. The prophet is not necessarily someone who prophesies doom and gloom. The point is life. The point is abundant life, abundant communal life. And the only reason why it's negative is because their society has failed to do that. The society that they are seeing there is rampant with corruption and exploitation and oppression of the poor. And the prophets are speaking against that reality. And I love this. This comes from, there's a biblical scholar he's a scholar of the prophets. He calls the theme salvation through judgment, which I just think is the most wonderful description of the prophet's task, salvation through judgment. Because the point is salvation. The point is an abundant community of justice. That is what the prophets are after. But you can't get that if you don't have an indictment of the way that your society has failed to live up to that. And the way that your society is actually being unjust and perpetuating corruption and perpetuating evil and perpetuating oppression. So salvation through judgment. Again, the concern being justice. So I'm gonna read some of these, and then I think after this we're gonna get into some more communal textual analysis where I'll stop talking so much. Let not the wise man glory in his wisdom, says Jeremiah. Let not the mighty man glory in his might. Let not the rich man glory in his riches. But let him who glories glory in this, that he understands and knows me, that I am the Lord who practices kindness, justice, and righteousness on the earth. Okay, that's a typo. For in these things I delight, says the Lord. What does the Lord require of you, says Micah, but to do justice and to love kindness and to walk humbly with your God? And finally, the prophet Amos, hate evil and love good and establish justice in the gate. See, the prophets they've done a lot of the work for us. Establishing principles, establishing ethics, establishing theology. There is so much in the prophets that we really could just pick up and copy and paste and say it today, and it would be exactly what we need as a church and as a world. All right, so now I want to move into looking at one of my favorite books on the prophets, Abraham Joshua Heschel. And the first chapter is what deals with the question, what kind of person is the prophet? So we're going to look at some quotes. Is anyone willing to read? Someone want to read this for me?
I will.
Great.
Okay. An unbearable extremist. The prophet is intent on intensifying responsibility, is impatient of excuse, contemptuous of pretense and self-pity. His words are often slashing, even horrid, designed to shock rather than edify.
All right. What do we notice here? Let's start with some words and phrases that we notice. What sticks out at you? Yeah, just Just spit them out. You can also chat them if you don't want to say it verbally.
I want to say that he's not exactly open to seeing that it could be this way, or he feels a little rigid, like that there's a right and a wrong, that there's not complexity and ambiguity.
Yeah, one-sided. I think that's actually
yes, right.
Elsewhere as an unbearable extremist.
Right. That's exactly
which
how
is yeah.
One of the phrases that jumps out to me. Oh, sorry, I think I started talking over someone.
Go ahead, Robert.
One of the phrases that jumps out to me is intensifying responsibility. I think there's very often a tendency that we all have to try and sort of put limits on our moral obligations or what we're called to do. So I think that speaks to something very interesting of saying, no. There's not some stopping point where you've done enough good, you've been loving enough, you've checked the box. It's very much against that attitude.
Yeah, it also seems like it's a bit of a reaction to a mode of behavior and of thought. And I just think even to my contemporary experience, my modern day experience, and that being one where when there is such a misinterpretation of Scripture, when there's such a misinterpretation of what faith looks like and can and should look like, there is this overemphasis on sort of ascetic piety. And so you find people who are wrestling with and in the process of engaging with their faith and having to navigate these waters of, okay, what is more of a surface understanding of what it means to be faithful and to be faithful to these tenets of justice, of mercy, of generosity, of looking out for your neighbor, in comparison with the more or less pious behavior of just trying to rule keep. And so I've found, for myself and for a lot of people in my peer group, where we're always kind of navigating this water of, what's really the voice of God here? What's really the voice of that leads me closer to that direction versus what is more concerned with an outward appearance? And so in that sense, I know that I become a little bit confused and sometimes lackadaisical in how I approach my faith, because I'm so embittered and I'm so used to trying to turn away from a focus on observance of piety that I do often end up still missing some of the real meat of what it means to be faithful. And so I wonder if it's that, if a part of this intensity and a part of what feels like extremism is a way to kind of shake people, a way to shake those that he's speaking to out of this more or less kind of docile faith.
Yeah. And that's exactly why I kind of start with these quotes from Heschel, because they're they're pretty early on in the book, and they're kind of offensive. Like we like middle ground, we like balance, we like equal representation. And these prophets genuinely just say, like, this is true, this is what I have to say, and it's true, and if you don't believe it, then you're a fool. And they use these images that are so stark, they're so heavy, and sometimes you're like, dude, chill, calm down. But that's kind of the prophetic impulse is not for edification. It's not to edify, it's to shock. It is to pierce the numbness, as Walter Brueggemann will say, to pierce our tolerance of evil, our tolerance of injustice.
Jack, I have a question around that.
Yeah.
So
can you say your name? You don't look like a Joanna.
No, I'm not. That's my wife. I'm Nathan. Sorry. So that last bit of that quote, that idea of being designed to shock rather than edify. I feel like when I read the prophets, and it could be like a visibility with a wider scope. Since I'm not living in those times, but I can't help but feel as if that it's not an either or. Like the idea that it's designed to shock rather than edify. I can't help but feel like as I read these things that the drive to edify, like the drive to build up, is like, it starts with shock. Like like you were saying a minute ago, like I almost have to shake you loose of your mooring, so that you can be built up. Yeah.
That's you're absolutely right. Like the building up and tearing down, those images are in Jeremiah, and like being the point. So it's not necessarily that they're, just totally focused on being negative and shocking people. Even this quote says his words are often slashing, even horrid, to shock rather than edify. But I want to start with this thread of they are going to speak a word that is not easy, that is not trying to be, it's like it's not like a Joel Osteen or like a purpose-driven life. It's not the power of positive thinking. It's not this like niceness. It's heavy and often horrible.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, we need to push through because I'm realizing we're spending too much time on these preliminary quotes. All right, an iconoclast. Who wants to read this quote?
I've got it.
Cool.
An iconoclast. The prophet is a lonely person. He alienates the wicked as well as the pious, the cynics as well as the believers, the priests and the princes, the judges and the false prophets. But to be a prophet means to challenge and to defy and to cast out fear.
They hate him who reproves in the gate. They abhor him who speaks the truth. I love that. You could put that on, and a book about Fred Hampton, a book about Martin Luther King, a book about Malcolm X, a book about James Baldwin. You could add a book about Angela Davis. They hate these people. They hate them. They hate the Black Lives Matter movement today. They hate him who reproves in the gate. They abhor him who speaks the truth. Okay. Is that really all I have of Heschel? Wow. I'm gonna have to come back to Heschel. I didn't realize there's so little. All right, Walter Brueggemann, The Prophetic Imagination. This was another pivotal text for me understanding the prophets. It's a classic. Brueggemann is a Christian biblical scholar. Who wants to read these chunks of text? I don't know what's wrong with the spacing here, but anyone? I can, if no one else wants to.
I think I just muted myself, but I can read it.
Thank you, Melissa.
The task of prophetic ministry is to nurture, nourish, and evoke a consciousness and perception alternative to the consciousness and perception of the dominant culture around us. Specifically, imagining the alternative community of Moses outlined in the covenant based on an ethic of liberation. The prophetic hosts a world in which the agency, will, and purpose of God are effective and to be taken with utmost seriousness. This, moreover, amid a regime that determinedly dismissed such claims and relied instead on a tepid God who functioned simply as a patron of the regime.
Thank you. Words and phrases that stick out to you in these texts.
Alternative community.
utmost seriousness.
A tepid God. There's actually something I forgot to mention in my discussion of Deuteronomy that relates to this. This quote right here, the structure of Deuteronomy closely corresponds to Neo-Assyrian state treaties that have been recovered from the 7th century BCE. At a number of points, the authors of Deuteronomy seem consciously to have patterned their covenant after such treaties. From this perspective, Deuteronomy is a counter-treaty. Its authors turned the weapon of imperialism into a bid for freedom. So literally, the book of the law that is spelling out this alternative community that these people are to be is patterned intentionally in contradistinction to the empire, to the way of the empire. So yeah, it is an alternative community. What else do we notice about this passage here from Brueggemann?
Jack, at that point, it really strikes me that God is seen as a patron of the regime. It's a domestication of God for the purposes of empire.
Right. Yeah.
That's pretty heavy.
Yeah, I mean, you think of just this week, Donald Trump like saying Biden, he's gonna hurt the Bible, hurt God.
Oh, right.
You know, like just like Trump's theology is so weak, right? Like he doesn't know anything about the Bible or Christianity or theology or anything. All he needs is the evangelical vote. So his talk of God is so superficial, and it's that tepid God who functions simply as a patron of the regime. Sorry, I'm being partisan. The prophets are partisan. I'm not going to try to not be partisan. Okay, so I pulled from Heschel and Brueggemann. I think I focused in Heschel on the more negative aspects of the prophets, and then with Brueggemann on the more positive aspect of the alternative community that they're envisioning. For that reason, there is plenty more in these two books, The Prophetic Imagination and Heschel's The Prophets. I highly, 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 highly recommend them to literally anyone. I would give these books to anyone to just read them, because rather than shocking, they are very edifying. And we have a lot to learn from them today. But with that kind of background, now let's get into like actually the meat of what I wanted this workshop to do, which was actually reading the prophets. So let's spend some time with this passage here from Jeremiah 22. All right, I've made y'all read, so I'll read this one, but then you'll have to read some of the future ones. Woe to him who builds his house by unrighteousness, and his upper rooms by injustice, who makes his neighbors work for nothing and does not give them their wages, who says, I will build myself a spacious house with large upper rooms, and who cuts out windows for it, paneling it with cedar and painting it with vermilion. Are you a king because you compete in cedar? Did not your father eat and drink and do justice and righteousness? Then it was well with him. He judged the cause of the poor and needy. Then it was well. Is not this to know me, says the Lord? But your eyes and heart are only on your dishonest gain, for shedding innocent blood and for practicing oppression and violence. Therefore, thus says the Lord concerning King Jehoiakim, son of Josiah of Judah, they shall not lament for him, saying, Alas, my brother, or alas, my sister. They shall not lament for him, saying, Alas, Lord, or alas, his majesty. With the burial of a donkey he shall be buried, dragged off and thrown out beyond the gates of Jerusalem. So a little bit of background. King Josiah was notable in the the biblical history for being a very righteous king who he rediscovered the books of the law and like wanted to focus on sort of redetermining society around the books of the covenant obligations. And so he is spoken of very positively in the Bible, but then his son is, the point is his son is not being like that. His son is doing the opposite. And this is like often a theme, you know, King David is good, Solomon is not as good, and then Solomon's son is even worse, you know, like so part of the indictment being you're not even being a good king based on the standards of what good kings should be. What else do we notice about this passage?
One thing that jumps out to me is sort of the reference of basically your father still did well when he was doing good. Did not your father eat and drink and do justice and righteousness? That think he was able to lead a good life in terms of meeting his own needs while doing what was called of him morally, whereas you just kept wanting more and more and more for yourself and decided, okay, well, I know where I'm going to make the cuts.
Yeah. And talk about extremism. You see this, your eyes and heart are only on your dishonest gain for shedding innocent blood and for practicing oppression and violence. That's not a very balanced statement, you know, like surely it wasn't only on dishonest gain. And you could almost hear some like apologists being like, are you kidding? Don't you know all the charities that he donates to? You know, haven't you seen what he's done for Black people or whatever? Like the kind of justifications that we try to point to in order to balance out these indictments or whatever. The prophets are not interested in that. The prophets are wholesale, are you for or against justice? What else sticks out at us in this passage? Those first couple verses, I mean, they are so timeless. Woe to him who builds his house by unrighteousness and his upper rooms by injustice, who makes his neighbors work for nothing and does not give them their wages. I mean, wow. When have we done that? When have we as a country done that? Who is doing that today? Who are the ones building their houses on unrighteousness, or who have built their houses on unrighteousness? Who are making people work for nothing and not giving them their wages? I don't know why I accepted this translation. I don't like this translation. He judged the cause of the poor and needy. It makes more sense to me, the translations that say he defended the cause of the poor and needy. And I quote that all the time because it says, is this not what it means to know me? To know the Lord means to defend the cause of the poor and needy. To know the Lord means to defend the cause of the poor and needy. I mean, why is that not preached every Sunday? Like, why are we not doing that? Like, why are there so many Christians who don't even care about the poor and the needy? It is so beyond baffling to me that their own Bible which they say is inerrant, which they say is written by God himself, says, hey, by the way, to know me, you got to defend the cause of the poor and needy. And they're like, okay, not going to do that ever. Makes no sense.
Do you think that's a judgment call, or do you think that's an inaction through ignorance?
Expound on that.
Well, early you had even called out the fact that most people who would tag themselves as Christians don't spend a lot of time reading these parts of the Bible. So, though it is clearly written in Scripture, could there be an ignorance there that has caused an action, or is it, I've read that, but that's the hard stuff. I'd rather stick with like the stuff that Paul wrote because I can get down with that.
Yeah.
I think everyone reads selectively, right? So if
right.
I mean, if you want to, see just Jesus and the prophets, then you'll ignore everything else. And
sure.
Conversely, someone could accuse us of doing the same thing. All we see is social justice, and we don't see whatever, something else. I mean, everybody reads selectively, right? So.
Yeah, I mean, certainly the onus is on the people who are saying that all of these words are written by God to like
sure.
really be consistent upholders of all that testimony. I mean, that's the biggest irony to me, is growing up in evangelical Christianity and often encountering Christians and showing them the testimony of the prophets and quoting these verses, and then having them more or less just shrug them off and not do anything with them. And it's so fascinating to me how you can still be selective even when you think that these words came from the mouth of God. God literally wrote this down for you. I mean, because that's their whole theology, is that when you open the Bible, God is talking directly to you. So you can read Jeremiah 22, what it means to know me, says God, is defend the cause of the poor and needy. And you go, okay, yeah.
I mean, to be inerrant, you have to read selectively, because you have to willfully overlook the contradictions in the Bible, the places where the Bible is not consistent.
Yeah.
So, in a way, it's inbuilt in inerrancy.
Yeah, I mean, that's true. And we are all selective. And I don't want to suggest that I'm biblical and they're not, or whatever. To me, it's so insane that here we have this testimony that gives us everything that we need to defend the cause of the poor and needy today, to be concerned about those who are disenfranchised today. And so many can see the same thing and not be moved at all to act on it. The clock is telling me we need to move on to the next passage.
Can I add one thing, Jack?
Yeah, go ahead.
One thing that I thought a lot about, just reflecting on my own experience, was that so often verses like this that seemed like an admonition, like a challenge, like a charge, to extend these modes of compassion to those who need it, was kind of swept up into this larger kind of evangelical salvation message. It was so, and as I got older and grew up more and more in the evangelical church, I found that to be the case a lot, where it was a lot of times where there was very specific rhetoric concerning action and considering what we actually do. Oftentimes when it was talking about the poor, the needy, the widowed, all of these various people who are always living life on the margins, so often it was
Excuse me,
the greatest...
I have to go. I'm sorry. Bye-bye.
So often that was the thing was like, okay, well, the way that we can really extend what the poor and needy really truly need is to extend salvation to them. And then that would always go back to these more New Testament readings of various ways in which you should be policing your behavior or your outward appearance or that sort of thing. And so, I think so often what has happened within some of these evangelical circles is that what really was very specifically talking about material needs being met, it was also often just kind of swept into this big thing of like, well, let's just go out and get them all saved, and as soon as they stop drinking and cursing, then they'll be able to do what they can for themselves,
Yeah, that's true. Thank you for saying that. The spiritualization of these challenges being the sort of annihilation of their material significance, like, does not give them their wages, becomes just the wages of sin versus salvation in heaven. Sorry, I did notice the one other thing I want to point out about this passage is the end of it, where he says, "They shall not lament for him, saying, alas, my brother, or alas, my sister." They shall not lament. Jeremiah is a lamenter. He's known as the weeping prophet. And he's often coupled with the Book of Lamentations. There are some who think that he wrote both of them, or the same author wrote both of them, or they came out of the same community or whatever. But the point being is there's this dominant theme of lament. And Jeremiah essentially says, if you know the truth, you kind of have to mourn. There is so much to mourn about. I mean, even just the fact that his first word in the book is alas. And they shall not lament for him. Like, they shall not lament for Interesting. I wonder exactly what that's supposed to mean, but I think of like those who don't lament for or mourn for the loss of really great people. And not to like bring Donald Trump up again, but when he was asked about John Lewis, like within a week after John Lewis's funeral, he was like, he didn't come to my inauguration. It was like, that was all he had to say, was like, I mean, fine, but he didn't come to my inauguration. And you're just like, you're talking about somebody who was literally beaten seeking freedom, seeking the right to vote. And like, you're not even mourning over him at all. You don't even want to admit that he's a good guy, And so it's like there's not an acknowledgement of the someone's witness.
I mean, I think in the context of this passage, it's that this leader is so unjust and so horrible that once he dies, they won't even give him the homage due a leader.
Right, which is like obviously
your
different.
Reputation will, precede you all the way to your grave.
Which
is another harsh word for sure.
All right, we have to move on to Amos. Who wants to read Amos? It's a good one.
Oh, I always want to read Amos.
You gonna read Amos first, Debbie?
Yeah, Amos is my jam. Okay. Therefore, because you trample on the poor and take from them levies of grain, you have built houses of hewn stone, but you shall not live in them. You have planted pleasant vineyards, but you shall not drink their wine. For I know how many are your transgressions and how great are your sins. You who afflict the righteous, who take a bribe, and push aside the needy in the gate. Therefore the prudent will keep silent in such a time, for it is an evil time. Seek good and not evil, that you may live. And so the Lord, the God of hosts, will be with you. Just as you have said, hate evil and love good, and establish justice in the gate. It may be that the Lord, the God of hosts, will be gracious to the remnant of Joseph. Alas for you who desire the day of the Lord. Why do you want the day of the Lord? It is darkness, not light. As if someone fled from a lion and was met by a bear, or went into the house and rested a hand against the wall and was bitten by a snake. Is not the day of the Lord darkness, not light? and gloom with no brightness in it. I despise your festivals, and I take no delight in your solemn assemblies. Even though you offer me your burnt offerings and grain offerings, I will not accept them. And the offerings of well-being of your fatted animals I will not look upon. Take away from me the noise of your songs. I will not listen to the melody of your harps, but let justice roll down like waters, and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. As someone who grew up a lot with language of people saying, oh, if only Jesus would come tomorrow, or if only the day of the Lord was today.
Yeah.
This is a rough passage for that kind of an outlook.
And it's certainly the word gloom is in it. So like doom and gloom is certainly like here. One thing to note about Amos is he was actually prophesying during a time when Israel was in like security, essentially, because here's Lova. The Assyrian kingdom was weak at this point. There wasn't really much of a threat in other areas. It was a time of prosperity for Israel and Judah. So when he comes along, he's really going against the grain. He is telling them that judgment is coming, that that horror is coming, that exile is coming, and he's saying it long before there are actually any signs that it's going to happen. One thing I love about this passage is we were just reading we were just learning in a sermon recently at my church that the way that darkness and light, those images are racialized, and how whiteness is pure and good and blackness is evil and hellish. And so within like a white supremacist Christianity, you like even the theology of good and evil becomes a theology of whiteness over blackness. And Chris and I were just watching this old movie called The Blood of Jesus, where it's made by African Americans, and it's set in an African American church setting. And the whole point for these characters is they are to be washed white as snow by the blood of Jesus. And Jesus is white in the movie, and the devil is black in the movie. And here it's the other way around. Why do you want the day of the Lord? It is darkness, not light. And I love that. That sort of the day of the Lord is the opposite of what you think it is. And that he is saying that with such fervor and boldness is pretty amazing to me. What else do we notice about this passage?
So, I mean, this has been a go-to passage for me for many, many years. And really, I think particularly the portion starting with verse 21 of hating your festivals is striking, because so often in all times and places, there is a tendency that people have to think about religion and piety in terms of checking certain boxes, observing certain sort of rote exercises and forms. Sometimes that's very outward facing, sometimes it's more inward focused, but the idea that really there's sort of a routine of stuff you're supposed to do for the sake of doing it, but none of it happens to have anything to do with your moral or social conduct. None of those things on your checklist happen to have to do with the often much weightier and more challenging decisions you make and behaviors you embody about how you relate to and deal with the people around you. And so it's such a stark repudiation of that tendency that I think we are all tempted with in all kinds of times and cultural settings, that it's, I think, a particularly good gut check, even among a plethora of those scattered throughout these texts.
Yeah. No, absolutely. As Chris said, the aesthetic piety. Is that what you said, or did you say ascetic piety, which is different? In any case, the point being that what is outward is so often so wrongly promoted instead of what actually matters, which is the weightier matters of the law, the matters concerning justice. Let justice roll down like waters and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. Probably where Amos is quoted the most, that verse. I see that verse everywhere. Martin Luther King quoted it a lot. It's quoted in it's on a lot of protest signs these days. It's one of my favorite verses. To me, it calls to mind the Pharaoh's army drowning in the sea. Like the waters plowing through the workers of injustice and overcoming them and replacing them with fullness and abundance and justice. Okay, this cat is really starting to invade my space. What else do we notice about this Amos passage?
Can I say, I want to type, I don't know, when I read that, I sort of think about my own church tradition and experience, which is mostly, high church Episcopalian, in which there is lots of ritual, some would say ritualism, right? But, the whole service ends with, let us go forth to love and serve the Lord. And so it's supposed to sort of, root us in God and the mission of God, which is to go out into the world and do good works and strive for justice. And my church, I like to think, tries to push that. But on the other hand, there's it's very easy to fall into sort of kind of an empty ritualism, a sort of a precious piety, right? So anyway, so it's for me sort of a warning away from, I like all the, smells and bells, but there's a deeper point to the smells and bells. If the smells and bells isn't on sort of a deeper foundation of serving God and justice, then it's just empty ritualism. So it points to sort of the tension in my church experience and contemporary church experience.
Yeah, I mean, and that temptation will be present no matter what tradition you're in. I mean, obviously it applies to traditions that are very focused on outward displays of piety or devotion, but it's everywhere. If your worship is not accompanied by a sincere concern for justice, then it is not true worship. That seems to be the point. What also strikes me here is some of the violent language. It is darkness, not light, as if someone fled from a lion and was met by a bear, or went into the house and rested a hand against the wall and was bitten by a snake. The prophets are often violent in their imagery, and sometimes they're violent in ways that make us uncomfortable and make me uncomfortable. But I think there is a rhetorical purpose to citing violence, and again, it's that principle of piercing numbness and piercing through people's tolerance of evil by by shocking. It's shocking to say that the day of the Lord is like fleeing from a lion and being met by a bear. That is not the depiction of the day of the Lord that we're given, specifically for worshipers, because this is not talking about, the people meeting the bear are the evildoers outside the community, but the people within the community who are concerned about rituals but not about justice. And that's a pretty crazy thing. Like, if you were talking about this day of the Lord as if it were not as if it were applying to sinners outside the church, but precisely to the church, then it's even more shocking almost. Like, how can you even imagine such violence? How can you speak such violence? Oh my goodness, you're insane. It's like some of the things that they're saying in the Black Lives Matter movement today are nothing compared to what you get right there in the prophets. All right, I think we need to move on to my other example. We've gone 12 minutes now on Amos. All right, my final biblical prophets text that I want to go over. Who wants to read this one from Isaiah? It's a similar passage. Similar.
I'll read it.
Thank you, Naomi.
Hold on, let me minimize the screen. Isaiah 1:10-17. Hear the word of the Lord, you rulers of Sodom. Listen to the teaching of our God, you people of Gomorrah. What to me is the multitude of your sacrifices, says the Lord. I've had enough burnt offering of rams and the fat of fed beasts. I do not delight in the blood of bulls or lambs or of goats. When you come to appear before me, who asked this from your hand? Trample my courts no more. Bringing offerings is futile. Incense is an abomination to me, new moon and Sabbath and calling of convocation. I cannot endure solemn assemblies with inequity. Your new moons and your appointed festivals my soul hates. They have become a burden to me. I am weary of bearing them. Will you stretch out your hand? When you stretch out your hands, I will hide from you. Even though you make many prayers, I will not listen. Your hands are full of blood. Wash yourselves, make yourselves clean. Remove the evil of your doings from before my eyes. Cease to do evil, learn to do good. Seek justice, rescue the oppressed, defend the orphan, plead for the widow.
Thank you. So obviously this is similar to there's a similar point here, but what we get here that we don't necessarily get in Amos is that pathos element that Robert referred to earlier. That I cannot endure solemn assemblies with iniquity. Your new moons and your appointed festivals my soul hates. They have become a burden to me. I am weary of bearing them. Like that's like profound, like suffering language, and it's God talking. Like God is actually moved to weariness because of how much he hates the wickedness that's rampant in his own community. And just the fact that he's calling them rulers of Sodom and people of Gomorrah, that he's talking to the chosen people who are supposed to be in contradistinction to places like Sodom and Gomorrah. And instead, they're being compared to them, which is, shocking. But that Heschel talks about that experience of pathos a lot as part of the prophet's mission. The prophet is supposed to share in God's experience and to share in God's own emotional experience toward the people of Israel, that they're supposed to embody the suffering and the passion that God has towards his people and toward justice, which is not an image of God that you often see, the immutable, the unmoved mover, impassible God who is, stoic, does not feel emotion, operates outside history, is not happened upon. These are classical images of God, and yet here in the prophets we encounter a different image of God, one who is actually suffering over what is happening on the earth. What else do we notice about this passage?
Can I say something?
Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to preface this by saying that I am Jewish. Hooray! I learned about the prophets from a totally different lens. And for me, one, this is what I was talking about when it sounds like the prophets are pretty harsh. I think a lot of this is about idol worship, which isn't something that Jack, you brought up. I don't want to totally divert the conversation, but to me, these prophets read as if a Hasidic community in Williamsburg said, hey, Jews, you're all doing it wrong. And it has the intensity of saying, we know, I'm the prophet. I am first Isaiah. I know what God is saying. And God is saying that everyone is a sinner except for a few select people who are still listening to God's commandments. So that's kind of the lens that I always approached the prophets with. And I wondered if that would be interesting.
Yeah, I mean, certainly there's a puritanical thread through the prophets too, where again, it's you guys are not doing it right. You should be doing it like this. But as I said, I mean, and obviously we're going to have people are going to have different ways of interpreting the prophets. But I think what they're doing is they are grounded in a tradition, in a very specific tradition, and in the tradition of the Exodus community, and in the tradition of Moses. And they are criticizing idolatry, for sure. But what I'm highlighting here is specifically their concern for justice. Learn to do good, seek justice, rescue the oppressed, defend the orphan, plead for the widow. And that, in these passages, is the problem with their worship, is that they have failed to do any of that, and instead they're focusing on the outward rituals on things that are supposed to make them holy by following them. But they're sort of saying it's not the outward things that you do that makes you holy. It's your concern for justice that makes you holy.
But I think this goes back to, the discussion about selective reading, right? Or how you can read this and not see, social justice, right? I mean, the prophets, some of them anyway, are very much into things like ritual purity. And so I'm just going to project and say, if you're an Orthodox Jew who's very much concerned with sort of praxis, with that kind of practice, then you're going to focus on those bits rather than the bits about justice. And then, as you said, in your tradition, you just didn't read the prophets at all. So, you can, anyway, that's kind of what I hear in this, is that you can read a lot into or out of the prophets depending on what you want to get from them.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I would want to encourage people to read whatever they want out of the prophets. Obviously, that is what people do.
I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that, we're reading it from a particular lens, and I don't think it's wrong. And, but anyway, it's just going back to the whole thing about, how can you not see justice? Well, somebody else would say, how can you not see all these things about purity? Or how can you not see all these things about, sexual morality or whatever?
Right. I mean, and the other thing that should be said is, like, again, we're only seeing like a snapshot of the prophets, and I am giving a particular picture of the prophets to tie them into the prophetic tradition in the African American liberation movement. So I'm specifically making that connection. But above and beyond this this workshop, there is a plethora of things that you can find in the prophets. That they speak to all kinds of things, you know. They say all kinds of things, and they complement each other and they contradict each other. And there's such an amazing array of diverse voices within the biblical prophetic tradition. And we should read it all, and we should wrestle with it all. We shouldn't be selective. We shouldn't only go with the stuff that we like and throw out everything else. But for the purposes of this workshop, I'm highlighting these portions, and there is this profound sense in the prophets that ritual is not the thing that makes you pure. What makes you pure is your work for justice. You're seeking justice, and that is the stuff that is very influential in the African American tradition. All right. Any other things that we want to notice about the biblical prophets or these texts before we move on? I want to take a quick break after this because I have to go to the restroom. But before we do that, any further reflections on the biblical prophets? Christian.
I just want to ask about the thread of the end of sacrifice, or a shift in what sacrifice counts, and wonder how that connects to interpretations of Jesus' death and resurrection as sort of the fulfillment of that thread of the end of sacrifice, and sort of shifting what it means to be religious from, I don't know, appeasing God through sacrifice to embodying God in terms of right relationship, shalom. And the prophets, when they do have beautiful images, they're very much like what Jesus depicts in terms of a banquet or unexpected people being reconciled or whatever. And that feels like it has a connection to the nonviolent movement among some African Americans. You're going to pick up a variety of threads of the Black liberation movement. But I haven't really thought it through, but it was just striking me that this really clear thread in the prophets about, against sacrifice in a certain temple-oriented way, blood sacrifice, if you will, might connect in an interesting way to interpretations of Jesus' death and resurrection, and to, I don't know, nonviolent movements for social transformation.
Yeah, that's interesting. Obviously, sacrifice in the Bible is like a huge, huge topic, and then what we do with and then Isaiah is hugely important for the New Testament and for our understanding of Jesus. And it's very easy to read Jesus into Isaiah. So I would encourage us to read Isaiah without reference to Jesus before we read Isaiah, with reference to Jesus. But yeah, certainly here I think there is, and Jesus says it like the weightier matters of the law, like he refers to the weightier matters of the law. And there does seem to be that element here of like, there is a lot to follow after. There's a lot of tradition that we have, but it kind of means nothing if there isn't any concern for justice. And, and then Paul will also say like, that passage about it's a resounding, everything's a resounding gong if there's no love, if it's done without love, you know. So I see that here, and that certainly gets picked up in the New Testament, that kind of universalism of, it's not necessarily the rituals that make the children of God, it's justice. I don't think Isaiah is quite going that far. I think I don't even necessarily think that he's negating any of the things that he's talking about, sacrifices and offerings and incense and all that. I cannot endure solemn assemblies with iniquity, is the point. And so I think if there is no justice in it, then God doesn't want it. I don't think that's the same saying God doesn't want these things, even like with justice, you know. And that would be kind of the Christian supersessionism, is to essentially say, like, see, God is saying, don't be Jewish, just be a Gentile or whatever, you know, like, and I don't think we can read that here, but yeah, the thing I wanted to highlight here is certainly the emphasis on seeking justice in all of these passages, that whatever your identity is, whether or not, like, you can be Hasidic, you can be a Christian, you can be anything in between, you can be an atheist, but like, concern for justice is paramount. Like, if you want to know God, you have to be concerned about justice. It has to include concern about justice, and I think that's the main thrust of what I want to highlight here in the biblical prophets.
Can I say, and you know, correct me if I'm wrong, this is sort of a question. I mean, my sort of understanding, or my sort of what I is the prophets, like Isaiah, is sort of a transitional period, right? In sort of kind of sort of the development of the Jewish tradition, sort of, you know, the sort of the tribal God, sort of, that was, I want to say primitive, but that's probably not the right word, sort of religion, right? Which is very much concerned about ritual purity and appeasing God and making God, you know, protect us and, you know, give us victory over our enemies and blah, blah, you know, that sort of thing. And then this is sort of the transitional period where Judaism is sort of injecting or kind of layering on sort of this concern for justice, and sort of moving away from sort of the pure ritualism and into sort of a ritualism based on, that's undergirded by ethics and so on. Is that true? Is that?
I wouldn't go there. That seems like a stretch. I mean, first of all, some of the earliest literature that we have, like, has that, you know, concern for justice and concern for the oppressed. Yeah, I mean, I think that's too neat of a portrait. I mean, certainly, like, Isaiah represents a lot of different periods of Israelite life, because it's written over a very long period, spans of time, and it's like revisited in different areas and added to, you know, you have pre-exile, exile, and then post-exile, and it all kind of culminates in this text. But yeah, I mean,
this is directly pre-exilic, right? So, and then the later parts of Isaiah are sort of in the exile. So this, and you know, the exile is sort of, you know, kind of the pivot point in Jewish history, Jewish tradition, right? Anyway.
Yeah, I mean, this is kind of getting into some weeds that is more edifying for, like, academic discussions, and I hadn't intended to, you know, invite a bunch of academic discussion, but I mean, you're asking interesting questions. there's very little that we can know with like concreteness about the development, or like a development of Israelite religion. And I think a lot of people steer away from trying to paint like progressive pictures, because like all the texts we have like are products of a very, very long period of development, and tracing any kind of historical one thing leading to another is very difficult to do, especially if you're trying to get behind the text and going, okay, well, what part of the development of Israelite religion does this text belong to? And I think that can be helpful, but is also like very speculative. Okay, I want to pause here and use the restroom, allow y'all to do that, grab a drink, whatever. We'll be back in 5 minutes.
Can you take off the screen share?
The point of this is to get everyone to read the prophets. So it's not, I'm not even necessarily trying to be super informative about the prophets, but to get people to go study them. There's plenty of study to do, but it's not going to start unless people have a reason to engage it. And so I think if by demonstrating their social oomph and their connection to the African American prophetic tradition, that I would inspire people to read the prophets, and that is the central point.
Andy Corso is planning the fall season of challenge at St. Lydia's, and we were just private messaging that we're going to use all texts from the prophets for preaching during this fall season of challenge, inspired by this.
So good. Yeah.
So it'd be fun to talk to you about texts to use for preaching.
Yeah, I've got a wonderful collection of texts about the prophets, so let me know if you need anything. And if anyone wants like recommendations for stuff to read, if you have specific questions you're interested in exploring, I really only want to be a guide for your own study rather than have you adopt my conclusions. But in that, I do want to recommend these two books, Walter Brueggemann, The Prophetic Imagination, and Heschel, The Prophets. At the beginning of this next part, I want to recommend this book, Cornel West, Black Prophetic Fire. This is kind of an overview of the African American prophetic tradition, more or less. It's written in conversation with Krista Buchendorf, who's kind of more or less interviewing him and dialoguing with it. They were talks that were transcribed and then published. So it's not necessarily the most substantial, like academic, historical, comprehensive look at all these figures, but it does introduce you to Frederick Douglass, W.B. Du Bois, Martin Luther King, Ella Baker, Malcolm X, and Ida B. Wells. And Cornel West is a wonderful speaker and a wonderful writer. And it's a great text for those of you who are interested in diving deeper into the second part of this presentation, which I will begin now. The Prophets in American History. Oh, I need to share my screen. Okay, so background here, I can kind of go through this quickly because I think we all have more of a background here because we have an understanding to a certain extent of American history. But the background here is obviously slavery, which is reminiscent of slavery in the book of Exodus. A lot of the slaves take up the book of Exodus as inspiration for hope for their own liberation. A lot of children get named Miriam or Maria or Mary and Moses. You know, these become popular names because of the Exodus. So similar to the way in which the prophets draw from the Mosaic tradition, African Americans draw from not only the biblical tradition, but also the American tradition. All men are created equal, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So it becomes very easy to make the case like, okay, how are you going to say that all men are created equal if not all men are created equal? If you're also saying that there are some men who are inferior to other men, black men are inferior to white men. And then at the same time, they go into scripture in scripture's testimony about God not being a respecter of persons, and all the testimony regarding freedom. You know, as I quote here, speak and act as those who are going to be judged by the law that gives freedom. How are you going to talk about the law that gives freedom if you're enslaving people? You know, if you're enslaving an entire race of people. And then beyond slavery, we get systemic racism, Jim Crow laws, racial segregation, and discrimination. We get a society built on a history of racial oppression, racism, slavery, white privilege, a society built for white people to flourish and for black people to fail. As Ida B. Wells says, the doors of churches, hotels, concert halls, and reading rooms are alike closed against the Negro as a man, but every place is open to him as a servant. So we have this entire society that is built on white supremacy, and yet it has these values of equality and freedom. And it has this Bible that talks about freedom, and the whole point of the Bible seems to be freedom. We have the book of Exodus about the freedom of the Egyptian slaves. And so there are all these elements within American society that contradict the oppression that is being enacted on African Americans. And they pick up on all this, and they're able to take this material and use it as an indictment against the American state, an indictment against white supremacy, in a very similar fashion to the way that the prophets in the Bible are taking the Mosaic tradition and they're saying, how can you have this tradition if this is what you're doing? Like, how can you be a people of God if you're not actually trying to be a people of God? And that's what the African American prophets are doing. So they perform a similar function. All right, who wants to read this quote from Cornel West on prophetic utterance? I guess it's pretty short, but I'd rather hear someone else's voice say it.
I can read it.
Thank you, Robert.
The especial aim of prophetic utterance is to shatter deliberate ignorance and willful blindness to the suffering of others, and to expose the clever forms of evasion and escape we devise in order to hide and conceal injustice.
Words or phrases that stick out to you in this statement here?
I have one of the. Oh, go ahead. Whoever was
please
about to speak. Go
ahead. Someone has to be.
I apologize. I'm driving, so I don't always see when someone's about to chime in. One of the things that strikes me right away is that phrase "forms of evasion," and it draws my attention to something that I read in James Baldwin the other day, where he was describing a police officer walking through Harlem. And he says, no doubt this white police officer likely sees the state of living that these children are living in. And no doubt this police officer is able to recognize that he would not want that for his children, that he would not want this kind of living, this destitute situation for his children. But nevertheless, his children aren't in that situation. So every day he continues to patrol the streets of Harlem and becomes more and more callous to this every single day, and is able every single day more and more to justify this callousness, to justify this sort of this ignoring, this form of evasion, this way of kind of escaping having to think about it. And that creates more and more callousness, which then creates like a more visceral response to that callousness within that community. So when I read these words from Cornel West talking about forms of evasion, these forms of evasion are subtle and they are prolific. I mean, our brains come up with so many different mechanisms for trying to protect ourselves from the discomfort of realizing the pain and suffering of our brother, you know? And so that's something that really strikes me right off the bat is that phrase, forms of evasion.
Yeah. I was reading this morning, James Madison, who was a founding father and a slaveholder, recognized that when one of his slaves was trying to escape, he writes that he recognizes that slave only wants the thing that James Madison wants, which is freedom. Mm-hmm. And yet in his mind, he maintains this system of slavery. He doesn't free his slave. He doesn't free his slaves. He still thinks it's tolerable. And I think that, again, the shattering, deliberate ignorance and willful blindness to the suffering of others, you know, like piercing the numbness that is causing us to tolerate injustice. I think that's the prophets have a zero tolerance policy on injustice, and so prophetic utterance, shattering deliberate ignorance, and exposing clever forms of evasion.
So on a sort of related note, one of the things that jumped out to me was this pair of phrases, deliberate ignorance and willful blindness. That's not the same as feigned ignorance or feigned blindness. And I think that's a really interesting juxtaposition, that ignorance can be both genuinely real and deliberate in some sense. Blindness can be both genuinely real and willful in some sense. That it's possible to have both. It's possible to say something akin to, I don't know what's going on over here, but I know I'm not going to like it, so I'm going to actively avoid going to look. This kind of two-element dynamic here, where there's a complicity involved in deliberately avoiding taking a clear look at or learning about some problem, but it's also a different phenomenon than being fully aware of something and then choosing to not do something about it or to not care. Both are problems, but they're different kinds of problems with different roots and potentially in need of different kinds of solutions to untangle them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, even the way that we talk about propagators of racism as people who are ignorant, like they're ignorant. And that word ignorant is like, on the one hand, it affirms their humanity in the sense that it says, like, if you truly knew, like, what was happening, like if you let yourself truly become aware of what is happening, you would not be making the stand that you're making right now. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, you are also complicit in your lack of knowledge. Like, you are letting yourself just go along with a dominant understanding, and you are resisting being called into question. You are resisting having your viewpoint called into question. Like, my mom going on Facebook and is like, I thought Black people wanted representation in the world. Why are we getting rid of Aunt Jemima? And you're like, oh, I see, because you don't actually care what Black people are saying. You just have this, like, a picture in your mind of like, well, Aunt Jemima, that's one of the Black people I know. And you're like, and now you can't say that anymore. And instead of actually wanting to understand why people are saying what they're saying and why people are doing what they're doing, why we want to get rid of this Aunt Jemima image, is instead of actually trying to understand, you just evade and escape, you know, and just remove it from your, and just like reject it, and just like, and then complain. And that is that deliberate ignorance of like, I understand that there are people in the world who are trying to tell me certain things, and I refuse to listen to them. All right, so with that kind of in mind, I want to move to this discussion of this wonderful woman, Maria Stewart. So some background. I can send. I should probably attach this article. After this, I'll attach the article I got this from that talks about Maria Stewart. She was the first American-born woman to speak in public in Boston in 1832. Claimed that God gave her the spirit of independence to proclaim a message of spiritual regeneration through community reform, education, and resistance to slavery and racism. She anticipated and even embraced opposition. Now, before I get to this quote, so again, this is that tradition of appealing to forgiveness, or to freedom. Forgiveness, that's funny. Appealing to freedom as not only the essence of the gospel, but the essence of the American way. That like, that it's almost, we're more American because we truly believe in the equality of all people. We truly believe in life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And holding that prophetically to speak in the ways in which, instead of talking about life, instead of promoting life, we're promoting death. Black Lives Matter is a way of saying life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Because we're saying we want to be about life. We want to be about all life. And we're not being about all life because we're oppressing Black lives. So, and prophetically using the tradition that we're steeped in to speak truth to the world, speak truth to power, and to offer a vision of a community that is based on equality and is based on freedom and is based on the pursuit of happiness. And Maria Stewart is one of she's at the bedrock of this community. You know, she's one of the first witnesses that we get for this community in America. Certainly one of the first women to be open and speaking about this, but also one of the first Black women to be open and speaking about this. Be not offended because I tell you the truth. I have enlisted in the holy warfare, and Jesus is my captain. In the Lord's battle I mean to fight, until my voice expires in death. I expect to be hated by all men, and persecuted even unto death, for righteousness and truth's sake. I highlight this quote in particular because it witnesses to the way in which being a prophet means being bold and daring. You know, Maria Stewart was a daring woman. And she was not only daring, but she's obviously talking about holy warfare and Jesus. She's fighting the Lord's battle. She's fighting for righteousness and truth. She is specifically writing herself into the history of God's salvation history, and she uses biblical imagery all the time, and she is specifically trying to evoke, I think, the prophetic image by speaking from the Bible so boldly and witnessing to this alternative community of freedom. What else do we notice here? Oh yeah, I included this. Blessed is the one who is not offended by me. Jesus says that in Matthew. That's kind of one of the prophets' calls. Blessed are those who are not offended. What else do we notice about this this text here?
I certainly notice the sort of martial imagery, holy warfare, the Lord's battle, expectation of persecution unto death. I think that's a really striking bit of rhetoric, but also certainly reminds me of some of the more violent rhetoric and turns of phrase and images that we saw in the Old Testament prophets.
Yeah, and she's very intentional about that, which is, again, can be alarming today. You know, like if any Black Lives Matter leader, they always call them leader of the Black Lives Matter movement. Like the articles, if they say anything militant, it's like they're immediately jumped on by the media and you know, by reactionaries. And yet here, it's in the prophets, and here there's a boldness to use military metaphors, I think, to employ them specifically for the pursuit of freedom, which again is a very American thing to do if you think about it. All right, I want to move on to the next one. I am realizing just how much time I'm taking up here. Frederick Douglass. Does anyone want to read this? I know we're down to the precious few, but I am still asking for volunteers if anyone wants to read Frederick Douglass. All right, I can. That's fine. Oh, had I the ability and could reach the nation's ear, I would today pour out a fiery stream of biting ridicule, blasting reproach, withering sarcasm, and stern rebuke. For it is not light that is needed, but fire. It is not the gentle shower, but thunder. We need the storm, the whirlwind, and the earthquake. The feeling of the nation must be quickened. The conscience of the nation must be roused. The propriety of the nation must be startled. The hypocrisy of the nation must be exposed, and its crimes against God and man must be proclaimed and denounced. What to the American slave is your 4th of July? I answer, a day that reveals to him, more than all other days in the year, the gross injustice and cruelty to which he is the constant victim. To him, your celebration is a sham, your boasted liberty an unholy license, your national greatness swelling vanity. Your sounds of rejoicing are empty and heartless. Your denunciation of tyrants, brass-fronted impudence. Your shouts of liberty and equality, hollow mockery. Your prayers and hymns, your sermons and thanksgivings, with all your religious parade and solemnity, are to him mere bombast, fraud, deception, impiety, and hypocrisy. A thin veil to cover up crimes which would disgrace a nation of savages. There is not a nation on the earth guilty of practices more shocking and bloody than are the people of the United States at this very hour. So what do we notice here?
I'm gonna keep going back to the things that sound like the prophets to me. Like this sounds very biblical in its tone and in its kind of like you did this wrong and like everything like is full of sin. And just the way it's written and the way the language works, I think it's very effective.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, he's obviously very intentionally calling to mind Amos and Isaiah, everyone who ridiculed the practices of their day, and exposing their lack of justice. I mean, just the way that he even says to God, all your prayers and hymns, your sermons and thanksgivings with all your religious parade and solemnity are to him mere bombast, fraud, deception, impiety, and hypocrisy. So he's not just even speaking for himself; he is speaking for God, which is a prophetic. He is taking up quite intentionally a prophetic vocation.
I have a noticing also.
Yeah.
I just noticed that in this passage and also in the prophets passage that we read from the Hebrew Bible, there was no preface of like, but don't worry, like these are all the good things Israel has done for the world, or like, don't worry, these are all the ways that the United States of America has like made the world better or like been great. Because, and I just would wonder if like, that's just not the job of the prophet, you know, like I think a lot of modern prophets get reprimanded for only focusing on negative, you know, like the 4th of July, like, oh, well, there's lovely, wonderful things we should be appreciating about the 4th of July, but like maybe that's not the job of the prophet to focus on those things. Yeah.
Again, the one-sided extremist who is only focused on whether or not the people, whether or not the world, the nation, whoever is addressed, whether or not they are concerned about the weightier matters of the law. And I mean, this language is very stark and very one-sided and very, you know, you'd think like if it wasn't Frederick Douglass, because like we're familiar with this speech to a certain degree, but like if any of us were to just say that to like our family members at the 4th of July, it would be like so shocking. You know, just be like, there is not a nation on the earth guilty of practices more shocking and bloody than are the people of the United States. Like, can you imagine, like, in between hot dogs, like, saying that to your family? Yeah. One of my favorite phrases is withering sarcasm. I'm not exactly sure what withering sarcasm is supposed to be, and I also just like that he lists sarcasm as one of the things that the nation needs to hear, like ridicule, reproach, rebuke, and sarcasm.
One of the things that I also found interesting is that he gives himself a sort of preface here that is very reminiscent of some of the language later written by Heschel to describe the biblical prophets, about sort of what the need is that he is responding to, that the rest of the passage then kind of goes for, of the feeling of the nation must be quickened, conscience of the nation must be roused, the propriety of the nation must be startled. This kind of very interesting preliminary explanation of, you know, exactly what is needed here is something that is profoundly jarring and forthright and goes right for the point in an unrestrained manner. And I think that's interesting because it's a sort of self-aware framing of exactly that question that we were just kind of getting into, of what is the job of a prophet or of prophecy. It's not to be all things to all people. It's a very specific sort of task to meet a specific kind of challenge in a specific way.
Yeah, and I think it's an opportunity, because a lot of us are that we go into church, or we go into our specific tradition and whatever it is, and we find ourselves attracted to the margins of that. Like we're often the people who go against the grain. We're often the people who call things into question. We're a little more cynical. We're a little more rebellious. And what I like about the prophetic tradition is that it's like it's built into the faith itself. It's built into the tradition to have this whole witness against itself. Like there's not an atheist in the world who hasn't said anything more critical of religion than the prophets have, and yet it's within the Bible. It's the Bible's witness against itself almost. And and Frederick Douglass is like specifically drawing on that. And then Abraham Heschel is very intentionally speaking in such a way that he is affirming the civil rights movement. He's affirming what people are saying in America and the prophets in the United States. So there is like a mutual fluency, I think, between like the prophets of the Bible, the prophets of the African American tradition, and then what gets written about the prophets in the 20th century. Which is very interesting. But again, like as you said, the language being piercing that numbness, the hypocrisy of the nation must be exposed. What is needed is not light but fire, not a gentle shower but thunder. And he gets these images directly from the prophets. I mean, in Amos 1, we get the earthquake. Like Amos 1 verse 1, like in the year before the earthquake, here's Amos. And we get these images of thunder and storm and whirlwind and earthquake. And it's because like God is troubling the waters, right? God is shaking things up because they aren't right, because the status quo is not what it needs to be. Oh, Frederick Douglass, he's amazing. And actually, the biography of him that I'm going to be reading, and Chris and I are going to be reading this, is called Frederick Douglass, A Prophet of Freedom. So I recommend. Might be fun to have it, to read that as a group. All right, moving along. It's 3:15. Martin Luther King Jr. This one, we know the most about him. I think we're the most familiar with him, but I think it's good to approach him in a new way, because we end up getting a dumbed down version of Martin Luther King, in our American social worlds. I've chosen text here. It was so hard to choose which text to go with for Martin Luther King, because he was just a prophet of God, so everything he said was directly from the Lord's mouth almost. But I chose these specific texts because they highlight his self-understanding as a prophet, because he really is somebody, I think, who not only emulated the prophets, but actually understood himself as being directly called by God to deliver a prophetic message. So does anyone want to read this? I can. It's fine. Don't be ashamed. Somehow the preacher must be an Amos, and saith, when God speaks, who can but prophesy? Again with Amos, let justice roll down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream. Somehow the preacher must say with Jesus, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he hath anointed me, and he's anointed me to deal with the problems of the poor. I don't know what Jesus had as his demands other than repent, for the kingdom is at hand. My demand in Washington is repent, America. Our ultimate allegiance is not to this nation. Our ultimate allegiance is to the Almighty God, and this is where we get our authority. What do we notice about these statements from Martin Luther King?
I noticed that it's really different to read civil rights Black activists say our ultimate allegiance is to the Almighty God and this is where we get our authority than it is to hear like Jerry Falwell Jr. say that exact same line. Like it reads very different coming from a population that was oppressed and enslaved and murdered than it does when I hear white people say it who have been in positions of power and authority.
Yeah, I mean, there have been some times where I'll read some of these texts and I'll think, I have not heard a word of truth in my entire life in the Christian church. How is that even possible? But I've like, because you hear what they'll say and you'll think, this is true. And it's like, it's that kind of self-evident, like, he is tapped into something that is far bigger than all of us. And I think that is what's so beautiful about prophets is when they proclaim the word of God, it's usually not to dignify a small specific, like put like a consecration on a specific construal of things. It's not to justify a regime. It's not to say, and this is why you have to give to our church or whatever. Like it's almost always to tie us into a longer, broader story, to root us in a past and give us a vision for the future, so that the prophets are pulling from the tradition of the Exodus and pointing to the future of the God's alternative kingdom, where God is king and not the emperors. And when you read these texts, or when you read Martin Luther King, he really is talking about the beloved community rooted in the witness of freedom throughout history. And that to me is a sign that you're listening to someone who is speaking the truth when they are rooted in something that is so far beyond all of us. Naomi.
I would argue this even ties into the way I read like Genesis 3, the fall from Eden, which is that I always saw the Bible as a story of like, this is a world gone wrong. This is not what God intended. Like, all of this is fucked up.
Yeah.
And that works as like a small thing for like the exiled Jews, but it also works, for almost everything that happens in the world. Like, our ultimate allegiance is not to this nation because, like, God didn't want America to be like this.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, and that's what the prophets give us, is they give us not just an image of our present, but an image of our past and our future. So they give us an understanding of how to root ourselves and a vision for what we are to seek for our world today, which is obvious. There's so much power in that. Yeah, Martin Luther King. It's a shame that we can't just read an entire speech of his, because he's so prophetic. All right, my final example. Thank you for sticking with me for over 2 hours now. Malcolm X. Now, this is probably contested territory. He not only is he not in the same tradition as like a Martin Luther King and a Maria Stewart, who are understanding themselves as taking on the legacy of Christianity. He's not about the legacy of Christianity because, I mean, he's a Muslim, but he still is rooted in the prophetic tradition. Muslims are rooted in the prophetic tradition. They also draw from the prophetic tradition of the Hebrew Bible and of the New Testament. And Malcolm X does a lot with the book of Revelation. And he himself does prophesy. He prophesies specifically he deploys the image of the day of the Lord, of the day of judgment. And so he ends up sounding quite a bit like a prophet, like Amos. So let's read these portions. Before your pride causes you to harden your heart and further close your eyes, and before your ignorance provokes laughter, search the Christian scriptures. Search even the histories of other nations that sat in the same positions of wealth, power, and authority that these white Americans now hold, and see what God did to them. If God's unchanging laws of justice caught up with every one of the slave empires of the past, how dare you think white America can escape the harvest of unjust seeds planted by her white forefathers against our black forefathers here in this land of slavery? According to the Bible, Judgment Day is that final hour when God will cause those who led others into captivity to go into captivity themselves, and those who killed others with the sword to be killed by the sword of justice themselves. This is justice. What do we notice here from Brother Malcolm? It's doom and gloom. It's negativity. You know, it's that he's harsh. Naomi, go ahead.
You know what strikes me, though, is it doesn't sound like doom and gloom. It sounds like, yeah, we need that doom and gloom.
Yeah.
Like, it's actually kind of like a hopeful message, isn't it? Of saying, like, those who have done wrong will get what's coming to them.
Yeah. Which, again, the theme of the prophets is salvation through judgment. And for Malcolm X, it's salvation through judgment. The salvation of America through the indictment and the fierce judgment of America's injustices. So yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, the prophets they're not just talking about wrongdoing. They're pointing to a world in which wrongdoing doesn't exist. So they're pointing to a world that is absolutely other to any world that we've ever known. It's the most positive thing you could possibly point to. But because it's the most positive thing, it is the thing that most contradicts the present. Because in the present we see poverty, we see oppression, we see discrimination, we see war, we see violence, we see suffering and evil and sin. We see all of this. And so to be a prophet means to indict all of that and then point to an other possibility. And that's exactly what he's doing. That's exactly what he does it. The reason why I think Malcolm X was a prophet is he does it exactly in the way that the prophets did it, by being one-sided, by being extreme, by being even violent in their rhetoric. Even though Malcolm X was not like a violent person personally, like he wasn't a violent, he didn't propagate violence, he wasn't out killing people, he wasn't out waging war on white people, but his rhetoric was often so militant, in the same way that the rhetoric of the prophets in the Old Testament is militant. And it's precisely because he is trying to pierce through that tolerance of evil, that tolerance of white supremacy. He's trying to shake people out of their complacency. Sorry, I really like Malcolm X.
Jack, it also kind of occurs to me too that, a big part of what my Christian upbringing taught me about prophets was that they were soothsayers, right? They were predicting the future. And that was a lot of like what my initial perspective was. And what I see Malcolm X doing in this excerpt is he's really pointing out the hubris of the American nation, who would think that it could somehow escape judgment, that it could escape criticism, that it could escape justice. And I find that whenever we don't have a future to look forward to, number one, but more so a past to which we can compare our present, it does put us in this position of thinking that like we're the only ones who have experienced this, or what, it's oftentimes it's looking to past examples and looking forward to what a new future could be that kind of decenters our current reality and decentralizes our understanding through our own lens. And so to look back and say, if prophets, if anyone would have had this kind of language to talk about kingdoms and empires of days long past, why on earth would that be only reserved for them? Why would we think that we've gotten to this point where we can somehow escape that justice and we can turn a blind eye to it, where we can evade a consciousness of it? And so I think that that's a big part of what looking to the future and looking at examples of the past does, is it serves to kind of decentralize the present moment, to break down that hubris, to break down that like my experience, my lens on this is the only one that really exists because it's the only one I'm experiencing now. And so to refer to any other timeline serves to kind of decentralize and say, no, other empires, other great nations, other great institutions have been humbled, have had to experience the storm, did have to be brought to their knees by the arms of justice. Why would we think that we're any different from that?
Yeah. And again, that goes back to the prophetic task of like thinking of your world as special in a sense, but not special in the way that it gets thought of as special. So for example, in the Israelite world, for the prophets, they were saying the fact that you are the chosen people means that you are held to the highest standard, means that you are judged first before everyone else is judged. So they thought of themselves as witnessing to the fact that God chose Israel, because they were saying we need to represent God to the world. And that means that we cannot tolerate injustice, that we cannot tolerate being like other empires in their exploitation of people and their oppression of people. We are special in that we have to be special. And it's in the African American tradition, this gets picked up in terms of we're the nation of freedom, apparently. Like we're apparently the nation where you have your precious liberties. We have, like, white people love to talk about the precious freedoms that they have as Americans. It's like, okay, well, if you want to be that nation, here's the standard. The standard is actually freedom. And if you're talking about freedom, then you can't have oppression. You can't have systemic enslavement of people. You can't have systemic imprisoning of people. You can't have systemic violence against people. And if you do have all those things, then it means you're going to have to call them out, address them, and get rid of them, and establish justice in the gate, as Amos says. And it's their failure to do that awakens the voice of the prophet. who is single-mindedly saying, I don't care what you've done in whatever area of the world. I don't care what you're doing for single mothers or whatever, or what charities you've donated to. You are profiting off of a system of injustice, and we've got to get rid of this, or you're going to have hell to pay, because history does not tolerate it, and God's not going to tolerate it. And that is absolutely what Malcolm X did. I mean, he was extreme in a lot of ways. He was a controversial figure. I like to point to him because of the way in which he was shocking and not edifying. He was an unbearable extremist, as Heschel said. And Heschel said, I think he wrote this in the 50s, 1962 or 1955, I guess. Oh no, that's a different one. 1962 is when the Prophets was originally published. I don't know how familiar he was with Malcolm X, but like in the late 1960s, if you're thinking of an unbearable extremist, you're someone who is one-sidedly focused on injustice and establishing justice. I mean, I don't think anybody fits that bill better than Malcolm X does. So, final thoughts on Malcolm X? Final thoughts on prophets in general? On this, any questions, concerns, comments?
This has been very exciting for me.
Mm.
You said a lot of things I disagreed with, so now I have to go do some research to see if I'm right or if you're right. I don't know. We'll find out.
Yeah. I mean, and that's the whole point of this. The whole point of this is go read the prophets, go read about the prophets. There are many great books about the prophets. Go read Martin Luther King, go read Malcolm X, Maria Stewart, Frederick Douglass, Angela Davis, Du Bois. Go read all these people. I mean, the point is to get us fired up about the people in our own history that have spoken to issues that we are experiencing to one extent or another today, and to become familiar with them. But yeah, thanks for tuning in. Thanks for coming. This has been incredibly fun for me because this is my wheelhouse. I love the prophets. I love the African American freedom fighters. That's what I'm doing. I'm working right now on my statement of purpose for applying to PhD programs, and it's all about this. It's all about the theological, essentially the prophetic tradition throughout history. Yeah, so it was fun for me to do this. Thank you all for coming, and until next time, I guess.
Thanks for Jack. Thank you so much, and thanks to everyone else. This has been really, really cool.